how do we know Scripture is true and not made up? How do we know we're not just judgmental bigots and haters like the world calls us? How do we know Scripture is true?
Well, you could be a judgmental, hateful bigot and Scripture would still be true. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive.
That's a good point.
But if every Christian didn't act like Christ, it wouldn't make Christ any less Christ. If every Christian acted like Christ, but Christ never existed, then it's all for naught, right? It's just a myth. So the question doesn't stand or fall on our behavior. The question stands or falls on whether or not the reason for the hope that is within us is true, a la the words below my hand here. So when it comes to how do we know Scripture is true, it's going to be the same way we know anything is true. Does it line up with what we can know about history? Does it consistently put forward its message? And of course, can it be examined to the standard and satisfaction of any fair inquirer? And fair doesn't mean you agree with me. Fair means that you apply the rules you would apply to anything else consistently. So in history, what do? We've talked about the external evidence for the Old and New Testaments before. I encourage you, high up, to look that up on your own time. I'll be spending more time in the New Testament in this question than you can maybe throw in more for the Old.
Sure.
Sound good?
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to the reason we trust any historical document, they're usually looking for three things. First, primary sources or early sources, people who were as close to the event as possible to avoid the potential of corruption over time, because that's going to happen intentionally or otherwise. If you can get to within the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses, which is very rare for anything over 1,000 years ago, it's as good as gold as far as historians are concerned. And even if it contains some of the most, obvious rip-offs of the culture around them or mythological accounts, they have no problem teaching it in schools because it's as early as things get. This is what people were saying within the lifetime, or as early as we can get to the lifetime of the individuals. Does the New Testament accounts meet that criteria? Well, yes, it does. Every single one of the 27 books of the New Testament, what give us the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus, the gospel in a nutshell, 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7, is all codified, meaning put into book format, within the lifetimes of the majority of the eyewitnesses, with no renunciations or contradictions at all. They were apocryphal, meaning concealed, cultic, false accounts that were written afterwards, but we know that they're false, firstly because the title page is a lie. The authors that are attributed to those books were dead by the point in time they were written.
That's a problem.
First red strike. But the second thing is that we have earlier sources that would contradict them. So that's the point of emphasis. We have primary sources, and when it comes to the gospel accounts, the writings of Paul the Apostle, Peter, James, and John, all of them were eyewitnesses of what they claimed about Jesus. Now, does that mean that they were telling the truth? No, it just means that they fit the right time period. That's a reason to trust it. It's not a conclusion. Understand that, because this is what oftentimes throws people for a loop. If there's a reason to question something, they automatically translate that as evidence that it's wrong. Anyone can come up with any reason to discount something ever. But if you can find actual reasons to trust something, the question is, do I have enough to form a reasonable conclusion? Primary evidences is one of them. The second is also interesting. Do we have more than one source that says essentially the same thing about what happened? We call this multiple attestation in historical circles. Now, you reference the Bible. People think that this is one book. It's not. It's a compilation of 66 books, 27 for the New, 39 for the Old, all verifying and attesting to one another to verify the events that they report. So when we look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they were usually put together to make it accessible to people who are reading it, but those are 4 independent accounts, all reporting the same basic events of a life. Now, if you look up, for example, the ministry of J. Warner Wallace, a cold case detective and forensics expert. He knows that when it comes to the differences between the gospel accounts, that's actually more evidence that they are reliable than less, because if all 4 of the gospels said the exact same thing, they would all either have to come from the exact same brain, who would process the exact same things at the exact same time from the exact same perspective, cultural background, and emphasis to a particular audience. The Gospels don't do that. Matthew focuses primarily on a Jewish audience from the perspective of someone who is good with money. keep the Jewish jokes to yourself for a moment. Mark was the perspective of the disciple of the Apostle Peter, John Mark, who did basically an eyewitness account from Peter's perspective with also an emphasis on Jewish culture. Luke, the historian, was a companion of the Apostle Paul who interviewed the eyewitnesses, multiple eyewitnesses in fact, and even according to modern scholars, and I don't say modern as like they're alive today, but contemporary scholars, respected minds who study these sort of things, especially on the Roman Empire, which Jesus' life took place in. What was his name?
Sir William Ramsay.
He said that Luke was a historian of the first rank in his ability to not only mention details that were relevant to the audience of those who were reading it, but would still meet any fair inquiry today. He wasn't a Christian until he did a thorough examination of the gospel accounts and then said, there's something to this, because he knew what to look for as a historian. And then the Apostle John, of course, speaking to a more broad Gentile audience, emphasized what it means to be God. The deity of Christ is a special focus in those things. Now, by the way, that in no way means that Jesus' deity is diminished in the other gospel accounts. Matthew came first according to the actual sources, but secular, liberal, atheist sources like Bart Ehrman that put Mark first. Do you know what the opening words of the Gospel of Mark are? This is the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Subtle.
Yeah.
So, multiple attestation, not only primary sources, but sources within the lifetimes of the eyewitnesses that are able to verify each other on the same basic fundamental events. There are differences, but none contradict each other. Unless you don't know what a contradiction is, then you can pretend that any difference in detail is a contradiction. But I like to stick to people who actually know what they're talking about. Sarcasm over. The third thing that would give you a reason to trust whether or not the scriptures that we're reading are true is because of accounts of embarrassment. Do they have to admit to things that they wouldn't want to unless they had to? That gives the, I guess, a weight to the sort of things that they're writing as being more worth trusting than if they, well, we're just making this up whole ham and saying, well, how do we make Jesus out to be the bit larger than life guy? You look at some of the apocryphal accounts and you'll do that. Some of the examples that you can get in the gospel accounts themselves would be, of course, the response of the eyewitnesses themselves, who all abandoned Jesus to a man, didn't believe that he was the resurrected Lord until after he'd appeared to them, and even admitting to doubt afterwards, even as he was ascending into heaven. They didn't get their acts straight until the book of Acts, pun intended. Well, on and on it goes. We can note that the first eyewitnesses of the resurrection were women. In a first century Judean Jewish culture, there was a quote from the scholars of that time, the Sanhedrin, who said, let the words of the law be burned rather than in the hands of a woman. They said that the word of a woman was not worthy, wasn't accepted testimony in court. And yet the entire testimony of the Christian faith hinges in a first century Jewish audience of a bunch of men having to admit the women believed before I did. If they were making this up, they would have been faithful through and through. Yet they have to admit things that embarrass themselves. Why? Because there's something to admit. That's a reason to trust something. Now, is it possible that the disciples were able to see, when did Napoleon Bonaparte conquer Europe? 1700s-ish?
Ish.
Yeah.
Ish.
Ish. Yeah.
1700 years into the future to know
Wellington
that,
beat him, though. Little shout out to Dave.
to know what kind of standards that historical criticism would be found 1700 years before it was even written and what things they'd be looking for. Yeah, I'm sure they could have gotten lucky, but that stands in the face of every single standard of historical inquiry that we can have. And I'm just scratching the surface. But when it comes down to it and the reliability of the New Testament, there is more reason to trust it than doubt it. The only reason you do doubt it is the difference between a doubt and a question. A doubt believes there is no answer. A question is looking for one. If you want to know reasons to trust the Bible, there are reams of resources, both in writing and in audio and video today, of people that can walk you through this and explain exactly what I have, but being slightly older, probably more reliable. The point being made, though, is this. If you're in a place emotionally where you're asking questions, there are also ministries that can answer not just where you're at intellectually, but even more importantly for where you are just spiritually. because more often than not, and I won't attribute motive here, but there's often more things going on as an obstacle to your relationship with God than others. Sorry to cut you off, but
Almost out of time.
I'll conclude with this point. Look up Gary Hamerbass and his ministry. He's not only the world-leading scholar and expert on the resurrection itself historically, but he also has a ministry exclusively geared towards people who are struggling with doubt. I encourage you to seek out his ministry and the way that he would treat you and where you're at right now. But if you have questions, the belief that there is an answer, we're more than happy and more than capable of giving you far more. This is just a sample.